Thank you for calling in to ASPS YPS Residence Webinar. I present to you Dr. Jacob Unker.
Hey everybody, good evening. Thank you so much everybody for tuning in. I'm just going to speak for a moment and then we'll get to the main event. As some of you may or may not know, my name is Jacob Unker and I am the resident representative to the Board of Directors of ASPS and to YPS. And we just thought this would be a really good idea as a kind of a precursor for the meeting where Michael Byrd will be speaking with all of us about contracting and a lot of other things, and just kind of some great information for senior residents, especially getting this year started. So I just wanted to introduce Michael Byrd. You all have his bio, of course, with you, so I don't need to go into all of his accolades. But I can just tell you from a personal standpoint, I've had the good fortune to know Michael for quite some time now, about 6 years. I trained at Southwestern, and he happens to be from Dallas, so I've gotten to hear him speak quite a number of times at the national and a local level. And personally, I've been able to actually work with him. He helped me out tremendously when it came time for me to get my job. So Michael is truly an expert in his field. He is one of the few people out there who really focuses on medical contracting, especially for surgeons, especially for plastic surgeons. So he's a great asset. We're very lucky to have him with us tonight, and I thought this would be a great opportunity for us all to get to hear from him. So without further ado, please, Michael, take it away.
Well, I appreciate the introduction, and good evening to everybody. I'm excited to do this, not just because of this particular topic, which I have spoken on several times and spoken on this topic on contracting from the employee side at the meeting. But this year I'm excited because we're going to have this presentation, and then when the meeting happens in Boston in October, we'll look at it kind of from a different view and look at it from the employer side. Part of my practice is representing doctors that are both entering practice and then mature practices that are bringing in doctors. And so whether it's a private practice opportunity, a hospital opportunity, or a faculty position, hopefully the combination of these two presentations will give you a nice view as to the things that you need to think about both inside and outside the contract. The starting slide may cause people to be alarmed. I know it does me, but this is the way the healthcare industry is regulated. And no one, not even the health lawyer experts, know all of this. The point for me keeping this slide in my presentations is just to understand, as you're going to enter into the business of medicine as a doctor, that it is a heavily regulated industry, and there are many wonderful opportunities both in the practice side and the business side, but it is so important to understand how the industry is regulated, or have advice as to how the industry is regulated, and understand how, in this case, it affects you on your initial contracts. So as you guys are making decisions about your first contract, from your perspective, there's three primary areas that most doctors are considering. One is a hospital relationship. Second is going into a private practice, and third is an academic contract. Kind of within that as well, there are still doctors who will go out and start their own practice, and that will be covered as well towards the end of the presentation. This is important because this same speech I gave for the first time at UT Southwestern in 2003, and the hospital perspective of a doctor going in and working for a hospital was such a minor percentage of what doctors did. And now I read a stat recently, and I don't know the exact figure, so this is don't quote me on this, but it was, I think, around 60% of doctors coming out of school are going into a hospital relationship. And the point is that is a growing trend, and I'm seeing that in the way that my contracts are coming across. And so it's something to be considered in the climate that we have, in this heavily regulated climate. And if that is what you're considering, there are things that are pros and there are things that are cons that go with that. And same with a private practice opportunity and, of course, with an academic. So the goal today in working through this is to equip you to understand the things that you want to look for in your first contract and the things that you really need to think about from a bigger perspective outside the contract. Like I said, the speech in Boston is going to dive a little deeper and give you a glimpse from the employer's perspective as to how they view these contract opportunities, and hopefully with the two of them, the knowledge you gain from this presentation plus the understanding you gain from how the employers look at it will help you identify and successfully negotiate with the right opportunity. So we'll talk through three different scenarios. We'll talk through first the hospital relationship. Secondly, we'll then go into the private practice employment relationship, and then we'll touch on faculty and may touch a little bit on starting your own practice at the end. And so I do want to pause for a minute before we jump in to let you know that I want this to be interactive and something that is useful. And so if you have a question during the course of the presentation, please, enter it through the chat. And if I don't see it, Julie will bring it to my attention and we'll pause and kind of talk through it. And I'm hoping to get done in time, too, to have an open forum once we work through all the slides. So again, before we jump into the three different relationships, this is context again. You have the first context that we provided that is the overview of how the healthcare industry is regulated. The second level of context is a little bit more intimate, but it's what you as a practitioner need to understand are the risks of going into the business of medicine. And so this list of 5 is my list based on my observations and experiences, and it would differ state by state. So this is not something that I would suggest you rank, and I specifically have the bullet points in there because I don't even think malpractice in Texas would be on the list of the top 5 because of the way healthcare reform has happened. It really is not a huge factor, but nationally, this is a massive consideration. So we'll touch on each of these. Malpractice. Why is this important? Well, if you're considering an opportunity in one state versus another state, I think your contract is not going to tell you one way or another what the tort reform laws and what the risks are, but that's a really important thing to understand as you go to enter into hopefully a commitment, at least a short-term commitment for the term of the contract, if not a long-term commitment, to understand what the climate is and what your risks are individually. And it can affect what your overall contract looks like when you start putting stuff like this into the equation. And so one example that we'll talk about later on is this concept of having to buy tail insurance. Well, if you're in a state that has a really tough malpractice state, it's going to have really expensive malpractice premiums. And your contract hopefully speaks to who's paying for the premiums. As we'll touch on, I tend to find that the employer agrees to that. But you'll also find a provision that says this is what happens when you leave. And it may require you as the employee to buy what's called a tail policy when you leave. And this can be quite expensive. So that clause that would seem innocuous could be a game changer as to your comparison of one opportunity in one state and another opportunity in a different state. Secondly, another big risk in the business of medicine is business divorce. So this probably most clearly applies to the private practice scenario, because in that scenario you're joining somebody, and who are you going to make this commitment to, both during the term of the contract and potentially a long-term commitment. And to understand that this is one of the areas that causes practices to go down is when you have a bad marriage. You have two people that either are not compatible to work together, or you find out that you have a person that's not a good person that you're going to join. And so this really underscores the importance of learning about the people you're committing to go into business with, and understanding their background, and they're probably doing the same. To a greater, broader extent, this applies to the hospital scenario or the faculty scenario as well, because the personalities behind who you're working with can affect your job opportunity in each of these scenarios. The employee overtime risk, this one is squarely a private practice scenario, and it is a growing area for plaintiffs' lawyers to attack all businesses, not just medical businesses. And it is an offshoot of tort reform, and there's a very liberally written law on how an employee can sue an employer if the employee claims that they've been working overtime and not getting paid for it. And why does this matter to you? Well, if there's going to be nothing in your contract that says anything about overtime, and you entering this contract will be an exempt employee, it doesn't directly affect you. But if you're going to join an opportunity where you hope to become a partner, and you're starting this investment with the initial contract and hoping to continue this investment long term, and you see a sweatshop type atmosphere where people are working overtime, I think there's a red flag that has to go into the equation of you considering this opportunity. The next is regulatory enforcement. One of the things a lot of people don't hear about is that one of the ways that healthcare reform is being funded is through increased enforcement, and increased enforcement against doctors. And so HIPAA has pretty significant requirements on being HIPAA compliant, and I would suggest that most hospitals are HIPAA compliant, and I would suggest that a very high percentage of private practices are not HIPAA compliant. And again, this would affect you not so much in your contract necessarily, but it would affect you if you're going into a practice that does not have a spirit of protecting patient information, because this could expose not only the business that you're committing to, but it ultimately could affect you. And for example, if you are there working and your patient files are not being properly protected, what happens if there's a HIPAA breach? And what happens if it's a HIPAA breach of one of your patient files? And then do you go back and look at your contract, and did you agree to indemnify them for something that you did, even though you really were not responsible for setting up the HIPAA protection policies? And so all of this is meant to really paint the picture of how important it is to look at the entire opportunity and to understand the things outside the contract that could affect you and affect your commitment to that particular opportunity. And the final thing under regulatory enforcement, well, there's two others. There's fraud and abuse and independent contractor misclassification. Fraud and abuse is probably stuff that you've heard about. You've heard of Stark laws or anti-kickback laws. And as you go into opportunities in a contract, if you see things that are aggressive from an industry perspective on how they're capitalizing on their business, it does raise that same concern of you wanting to understand that and understanding what the risk is. One small example that we see, I've seen a couple times in Texas in the last year, is plastic surgeons hiring a plastic surgeon to come into their practice in an out-of-network model to do breast reconstruction. And they do so because the reimbursements on going out-of-network in the contracts are significant right now. Well, that's not really a fraud and abuse issue, but from a regulatory perspective, almost anyone who talks about it will agree that that has a short shelf life. And, some people say 12 months, some people say 18 months, and then that they'll regulate around that so that the reimbursements are not so crazy. Well, if you sign a contract where you're hired based on the premise of these huge reimbursements, then the dynamics of your entire practice could change in the next 12 to 18 months. So that's a pretty significant risk and something that has to be considered in considering your opportunities. The independent contractor misclassification law, I see in other specialties, not so much in plastics, but if you have a practice that is significant in having people that are there every day and they're contracted as independent contractors, that does create risk to that practice. And again, for you, if you're considering joining that practice, it creates risk to the entire opportunity because there's significant IRS implications if an employer treats someone who's actually a full-time employee as an independent contractor. The last big risk, and this is very specific to plastics, although it's even growing in every specialty, is reputation management. You probably can sense that if you go to any of these conferences and see how many different topics there are on reputation management. Here again, when you're considering the contract, it's probably good to go and check the online reputation of the practice or group of doctors that you're joining, whether it's a hospital situation, a faculty situation, or a private practice situation, because again, you're going to be associated with the people you sign on with, and your reputation is going to be affected by their reputation. And so there's not going to be anything in the contract again about this, but it's something that is important, and it's not so much as figuring out if it's a good guy or a bad guy that you're talking to. It's finding out how are they perceived and how, even if someone has just a bad outcome where, you have a patient that goes out and creates a website specifically against the doctor, that does affect things. Even if there's a great explanation as to what happened, you have to be aware of that and understand how it could affect you and your practice. So now we're going to move into the different types of contracts that you may be considering. With the hospital relationship, there's really two different types of contracts that you'll see. One concept is called the income guarantee, and really what this is if you want to think of it in pure business terms, it's the hospital being the bank and agreeing to fund you to a degree to come and either A, start your own practice, or B, fund a practice for you to join so that the bank is guaranteeing you a certain level of income, and that would make an employer theoretically more interested in bringing somebody on board. And then there's the pure hospital employment concept, which is hospital or a affiliate of a hospital, usually a nonprofit type entity, offers a contract and you are a traditional employee of that hospital. So we'll first walk through the hospital income guarantee. We'll dive a little bit more deeply into this in Boston as to what the hospital, why they do this and what they're looking for. But very generally, the hospital uses this as a mechanism to recruit, and it is a federally regulated concept that is, like I said, heavily regulated. And so they have parameters where they can guarantee someone's income. And generally what it'll look like, and just to keep it simple, look at it as a doctor being recruited to an area to start their own practice, and a hospital saying, wanting to help them come and be a part of the hospital. And what they'll do is you'll sign an agreement that looks somewhat like a loan, because that's what it is, and says, we're going to guarantee you X. We're going to guarantee, for example, $20,000 a month for the first year that you're here to help you transition into starting your practice. And if your collections in month one are zero, then we'll write you a check for $20,000. It'll be a loan. In month two, let's say you collect $5,000 from your work. We'll write you a check for $15,000 as a loan, and so on and so forth, until typically a year. Sometimes they're a little longer, sometimes they're shorter. That's called the guarantee period. Once that guarantee period ends, then you go into a period of time where you're on your own, and there's that amount freezes, and so long as you track with certain requirements, you don't have to pay that money back. It will be forgiven over a period of time. And so their hope is that you're kind of committed to the area for anywhere from 3 to 5 years, and they'll forgive that debt along the way. So there's a couple of things to watch out for in doing this. The first is that during that guarantee period, at some point you may actually become busy, and you'll have a balance out there. And so let's say in month 7 you have a nice month and you collect $60,000. Well, the way they're written, the documents are written, is that you would actually have to take the 40 over the 20 and pay back your debt. This is during that first typically 1-year guarantee period. And so it's important to understand when considering going into this arrangement that you are locked in, for the most part, at $20,000 a month, if that's the guarantee amount, during your first year. Because when you perform at it later, it's going to be paid off. And the only way that you really are free of that is if you become busy enough that your debt actually goes down to zero and you're on your own before the year's out. The second thing to kind of big picture consider is, as this debt is being forgiven, there's a tax event to each of you. So when you're written that first check for $20,000, there's no taxes taken out. And so it's important that you have planning with your CPA so that later on, when you have forgiveness of debt, that you have cash set aside to pay that tax liability that happens in the years that the debt is forgiven. And it is really unfortunate when I get the phone call after someone's about 3 years into it and they've had $100,000 forgiven and realize that they owe the IRS $30,000 on money they didn't receive that year, and they spent everything that they got during the income guarantee period. So the types of things that you'll see in the hospital income guarantee, like I said, the guarantee of payment that we've kind of walked through, they'll have other perks through there, moving expenses, signing bonus, and there can be other benefits. And then their expectation, again, is the repayment kind of under the parameters we talked about, and of course that you're committed to practicing medicine in the 50-mile area of that hospital, and that's just purely a regulatory requirement as to why they don't go so far as to say you have to practice at our hospital that entire time. So you have to be aware of these, but this if you step back and look at it from a business perspective, can be an extremely attractive way to start your own practice. It is a much cheaper form of money to borrow than going to a bank. Ultimately, if you just stay there, it's all forgiven. So with proper planning, if you set aside money as it's being loaned to you, you won't have a tax challenge down the line. And there have been many successful practices that have started through this. And I would say since Obamacare, the growth of income guarantee contracts that I see has been quite significant. The downsides, like I said, there are limitations on the earnings during that initial period. Secondly, there are a lot of, even though it's a regulated document and most income guarantees have generally are 80% the same as the other ones, there's a lot of different just things you have to look for in them, and there can be some risks. In other words, what happens if a doctor dies? How can you how can you use funds to start your practice, and for what purpose? And my example there is I had a doctor who got an income guarantee, and he was excited about it, but he was going to live with family and not use it for his income, and use all the money to furnish his new lease, buy all the equipment he was going to need, so that at the end of his first year, he would have a decked out practice that was not that he didn't have to pay for, that he borrowed and it would be forgiven over time. And he was pretty far along in the process when he brought this to me. And you go through the contract, and it was very clear that that was not an allowed use of funds. And had he signed the contract and gone forward, he would have found that he would not have been allowed to do this, and it ended up killing the deal, and he ended up going a more traditional route after that. At the time, more traditional. This is actually becoming a pretty traditional route. So now we'll transition into hospital employment. And this is definitely a consequence of healthcare reform. And I would say this isn't the first time. In the 90s, many years ago, this was a big push. There was this concept of managed care was out, and hospitals were acquiring practices, and it was as big of a push as you see now. What happened is that the physicians didn't work the same once they got into the hospital, and they were out from the risk of running and the entrepreneurial enterprise of having their own practice. And so there weren't incentives built into the contract. There was bureaucracy, and in large part it failed, and many practices ended up reacquiring their practices from the hospital through this. Well, now what's the motivation since healthcare reform? Well, if you take yourself back to the beginning of this presentation, when we were talking about the top 5 risks, a hospital relationship really minimizes those risks. I mean, it is definitely the safe play currently, and some that will go into this long term. And so the pros are that there's a guaranteed salary, there's stability, there's management provided for the doctors who are not interested in the business side and want to just be practitioners. There's less regulatory issues, and for the future, and you'll notice on this slide I have alignment highlighted, the big fear that you'll see out there is practices and hospitals wanting to go big and wanting to be aligned because of what they see in the future of healthcare and particularly insurance reimbursements. And so one example I have that I use actually in all my speeches, but it does happen to be a breast reconstructive surgeon, is a physician who was in private practice his entire career, and most of his business, despite the fact that he had an impeccable reputation, most of his business were referrals from oncologists at his local hospital. And this hospital decided that after healthcare reform, it wanted to be aligned, it wanted to go big, and it wanted to house all of its own doctors. And the power play the hospital used was, you can either come and join us and be part of the system, or you'll be cut out and we'll bring somebody else in, and all the patients are going to stay in-house for all the services that are needed. And these are real considerations. They're not issues I talk about every day, but they're very real. And for the doctors that do not have the appetite for the unknowns and the risks that go into the private practice, this can be a really desirable opportunity. And again, I think the statistics support this in the number of hospital employment contracts that are coming for doctors straight out of school. I think that's a factor of, one, the appetite of the doctors, but two, the push on opportunities for hospital employment. The next area that we'll move to is the private practice employment. Since we're about to start on private practice employment, I do want to have a transitional note about this hospital income guarantee concept. It is extremely common, I mentioned it earlier, for a three-party arrangement to happen in the recruitment of a new doctor, and that is, a hospital wants a bigger presence, a practice is interested in having a doctor join, but not interested in taking the risk in guaranteeing a salary and the increased overhead that goes with bringing a doctor in. And so this is allowed under this heavily regulated concept of a hospital income guarantee, or you'll hear the term hospital recruitment agreement. And it's a three-party agreement, and it's an agreement where the same concept of this funding and guaranteeing of the income happens, except in this scenario, the hospital writes a check to the practice, and the practice pays a salary to the doctor. You don't have the same issues as the employee on future tax issues for the forgiveness of the debt, because that happens at the practice level, where the hospital loans the money to the practice, and the practice is the one that is receiving the debt and receiving the forgiveness. And when it's paid to the physician employee, it is actually taxed just like a regular W-2 employee. But this is a common arrangement, and it can be a little bit more complicated because, frankly, you're dealing with two different parties now instead of one. But it can be a great tool to get into a practice that you want. In fact, I've had clients who have talked to me about wanting to join a particular practice, and they're stuck because the practice really isn't willing to offer much in terms of compensation, and so there's a lot of risk that the employee doctor is about to take on. And we'll talk about, are there any hospitals that would be willing to recruit? And we've had actually these recruitment agreements grow out of those conversations where there was a hospital involved, and that ended up turning something that was going to be, you have an office to work out of and you're going to get a big piece of collections once you get busy 6 months down the line, but otherwise you're going to be starving, into a guaranteed salary that was, competitive with the market.
Excuse me, Michael, we have a question from Dr.
Sure.
Patel in the chat.
Okay.
He wanted to know the malpractice implications of tail versus no tail versus indefinite tail coverage in the setting of training subspecialty fellowship in private practice. Some programs offer tail coverage for the duration of the fellowship that carries from fellow to fellow. Some simply don't have the funds for tail coverage and ask that you pay for this yourself. Does it matter in the trainee scenario?
I don't know on it, and when you use the word trainee scenario, you're talking about as a fellow. If you sign on a contract that you don't have tail coverage, I think if you're required to have it, and you're required to pay it, that there's risk there. Typically, what you'll find is that the costs when you're in the entry level is much less significant, but I don't have an example of having worked with a fellow who's been required to pay the tail. I've heard of it happening, so it's not surprising. But so I haven't gone into the mechanics. Where I've seen the problems arise have been the 5th and 6th year doctors who leave a practice. I had one example that's a plastic surgeon who had a mixed practice of cosmetic and reconstructive, who was leaving kind of a multi-specialty opportunity to go into a hospital employment. And he received his quote for the tail, and I want to say it was $70,000, $60,000, and his contract required him to pay the tail. And so that was a real significant portion of our negotiations, both with the exit and with the entry into the new opportunity. My suggestion would be to not ignore this issue, because if there is an obligation there may be an opportunity as you're considering your next job to have the employer agree, the prospective employer pay your tail obligations, kind of like the concept of a signing bonus or the concept of moving expenses. I think all of those things are on the table and are quite common. Like I said, I have not really seen this come up in this fellowship instance, but that doesn't mean it's not there. But that would be my recommendation on how to deal with it. Would be to get your arms around it now rather than later, and see if there's a potential financial obligation down the line, and if there is, then definitely would want that to be in play as you're negotiating your contract, your first contract. So if you guys have questions, just text it. And thank you, Julie, for pointing this out. I was focused on my train of thought, so I appreciate you intervening to raise the question. So as we kind of transition into private practice employment, these are all the things on this slide that you want to, inside the contract, are the big ticket items that you want to think through. And they're probably, at least on the surface, intuitive and things that you would think about, at least as it relates to compensation, and as it relates to the covenant not to compete. But these other things are important. And again, from the employee perspective, the things that matter about this go really into your circumstances. So if I talk to 10 different doctors, there are so many different circumstances that make all of these different scenarios more or less important. So one quick example, if a doctor says, I really am moving back to my hometown, my goal, my whole career, as I went through medical school, is to be in my hometown. I'm going home. And this practice, I'm not so sure about, but they're there, and I can at least start there. Well, I can tell you, if your plan B, if this doesn't work, is to stay right where you are, and you have a really strong non-compete, that's a big deal, because that can cause substantial risk. And then the flip side is, and this is quite common, the doctors say, well, I'm going to go here, I'm going to be really busy, I'm going to get my cases for my boards, and you know what, I'm out of here. If this doesn't work, I'll go back home, I'll go wherever, I don't really care. Well, even if there's a strong non-compete, that all of a sudden is a much less important issue. And it's important to understand these different variables, because you really, and I'll talk more about this in Boston, but you only have so many kind of arrows in your quiver that you can negotiate without scaring the employer off. And so you have to be really prudent and pick your spots, not give up something that you're unwilling to give up, but also be mindful that they have a perspective and you have a perspective, and really understanding what's most important to you. So we'll walk through each of these from a big picture, and there are some things outside the contract that you want to think about when you're thinking about these, for example, compensation, but for any of these. So the highlight here, this is my strongest recommendation, is understand patient referral flow, and taking it even bigger or more specific, understand how busy you can be at a particular job opportunity, because I've had many nice guaranteed contracts turn into really bad situations where it just turns out there wasn't the need there that you thought, or doctor gets there and the doctor thinks that they've been paid $200,000 a year and that they're just waiting for all the patients to be sent to them. Meanwhile, the employer is thinking, back when I started my practice, I was on the streets doing everything to get this thing going. Why is this person so entitled and lazy? And then all of a sudden you have this huge controversy or conflict because each had different expectations that weren't addressed on the front end. And then bringing it back again to the compensation, your ultimate level of income is going to directly relate to your busyness. I mean, there are other factors, the types of cases you do, the types of reimbursements, all that stuff. But at its core, at this level of your evaluating your contract, I mean, if the patients aren't there, that's a significant issue. And so it really adds insight in comparing two different opportunities. If one's a big guaranteed salary that has a lot of risk as to busyness versus one where, the doctor is just that you're joining is so busy, doesn't know what to do, but he's only willing to pay you a percentage of collections, but you can reasonably see that you'll have significant income early, then it does help influence that opportunity. So my encouragement is don't just flip to the contract and look at the number and move on at that level, that there's really the business behind it, or the potential business behind it, is really important. And that you'll never have all the answers. There's going to be risk, but those are the types of questions and conversations you have with your potential opportunity. And that applies whether you're faculty, whether you're at a hospital, whether you're in private practice. Even though we're talking specifically about private practice now, if you're not busy, then your importance is diminished as from a business perspective. It's important to understand the structure. No two are alike, although I will say the most common structure that you'll see for compensation is some level of guaranteed salary and some formula once you've had a multiple of that salary where you kick in and get a percentage bonus. So the next level, we're transitioning out of compensation and kind of talking about the big ticket items for your private practice employment, is ownership. This is really an area that we'll dive deeper into in Boston because it's so important to understand kind of the employer perspective on this, and it'll really help you have an idea as to how to get your arms around this. And the importance here is you're going to sign a contract that's for 1 to 3 years in a private practice scenario, and most likely the contract is going to say anywhere from nothing to minimal about what life looks like after that. And if this is a contract that is a long-term play for you, this is extremely important, because you're going to go sign a contract that may even have a non-compete in it that says I'm going to be engaged to you, but I don't really know what marriage is going to look like. And so this concept of the 4Cs is a term I've coined that I've used in speeches. I coin it just because it helps take something that's extremely complicated and hopefully simplify it, because these 4 areas are the areas that make or break a partnership negotiation. So we're just going to, this is a moment in time, even though this is your first employment contract, where we're going to fast forward to what partnership is, and these are the 4 things that you want to understand. You probably won't have it written in your contract, but you may have something written in your contract that generally talks about it, or at the very least you want to have a conversation with your employer to understand what they're thinking about this so that you can have a better picture of the long term. So for cost, the key there is, and this is the term that I hear all the time, for cost is, it's going to cost me $100,000 to buy in, and it's, just a country club membership, practices aren't worth anything, and so on and so forth. Well, the next question I always ask, whether the purchase price is $25,000, $2,500, or $1 million, and I've seen all of those, is what are you buying, what are you paying, and what are you receiving? And I've seen many a deal that were $50,000 buy-ins that were significantly less valuable than $1 million buy-ins. And so the encouragement at this level is, first of all, to be thinking about this when you're looking at your first employment agreement. And secondly, as it relates to cost, don't be so dismissive of the surface level answer of the price is X and that's what you get for being a partner, because there's so many other factors that influence whether that's a fair price or not. The next, this again is going to be more of a Boston topic, so I'm not going to touch on it, but really the important thing to understand is that when you're buying into a practice, the valuation range can be quite significant, and it can be anything from kind of an accounting book value approach, which is the typical low end of the spectrum, to a traditional certified appraiser looking at the income and coming up with a valuation that factors the profitability of the practice. And so it's at this meeting, the important thing to understand is just that there's no one way to value a practice, and it's important to understand that, because you can't get your arms around what a valuation is until you can get your arms around how practices are generally valued. Again, this will be an area that we'll really dive deeper into in Boston. So the next is compensation model, and this is compensation at the shareholder level. This is the third C, or the second C actually. And again, it's important to understand, once you've paid or agreed to pay to buy in, what does compensation look like once you have joined the practice? Is it an overhead sharing arrangement? Are we kind of benefiting from the greater good in some way? Or the extreme example, which is what we call the communist model, once you're a partner, we share everything. And there's significant good and significant risks that go with any of these, and it's really important to understand this as you go into your first contract. I noticed a question that is, how do you go about investigating the market and the potential earnings for a specific city/location? Well, it's really hard to get exact numbers, but there is a publication called MGMA that we carry that tends to be a little outdated, but it does help give you at least some range for a particular area as to what they are. Our practice, my firm, is a national firm, and so we do have a decent amount of data just from our experience. But again, unless you have a connection to where you can really dig in and get some insight in a particular market, it's going to be hard. Now, just from doing as many contracts as I've done, I mean, I know that, if someone walks in and says that they've got a job opportunity in California that is going to be a guarantee of $80,000 and some percentage of revenues above and beyond that, that I see in California. If someone came in to tell me that that's what they had in Dallas, I would say that that's well below market. And so, it's never going to be an exact answer, but there are some resources out there to help you get your arms around it. As we move to the third C, and I skipped through the different comp models again. We'll talk more detail in Boston about those. And again, those are comp models as a partner, and they just so directly influence the long-term relationship, because there can be any number of expectations of what life is going to look like once you become a partner. The third is control. This makes or breaks deals. It's the third C. Think about a two-man practice. You join, who makes the decisions, who has the final say. When there's only two people, it's a tough one, and you really have to talk through your own expectations and help identify those. It's important to try to learn as much about what the philosophy is of the opportunity you're joining, and make sure that works, because if that's not dealt with in the initial contract, that's an area where things can blow up once you get to the negotiation for the shareholder contract. Same with the other two C's, compensation and cost. And then the final one is contingencies. And I'll say this probably is less likely to cause you not to sign a partnership agreement once you become an owner. But this is all the critical what-ifs of what life looks like once you're a shareholder. And if this isn't dealt with, this is where really expensive litigation ensues. And mostly just because there are so many contingencies out there that if you don't talk about it, the risk of conflict is just through the roof. And so just by working through it, you significantly reduce your risk, and then hopefully by having an agreement, you really reduce your risk. So we'll kind of transition this out of the ownership piece of understanding what buy-in is going to look like. Again, this is part of the important things to understand in your first private practice employment agreement. Ancillary entities, with plastics or reconstructive, is there a surgery center? If there's cosmetics, is there a medical spa? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I have a hand surgeon who's having to be an owner in a med spa, and that's not a beneficial thing for him because he doesn't do cosmetics. So, but the flip side is there's many times where this is desirable, like the practice itself may be pretty solid, but you can be having these different revenue streams can make the opportunity look completely different. Non-compete, every state is different. My encouragement is to understand what that is and to understand what generally, just what's your plan B, because the answer to that question directly influences how important you need to think through this non-compete. Again, we've talked through the professional liability insurance already, but this is a really important part of your first private practice employment agreement to understand who pays for it and understand what types of policies. There's actually some types of policies where a tail is not required. Those are called occurrence policies. And so the contract itself may be set up generically, but it could be a question to the office manager of the practice that will help understand what that looks like. So, faculty contract. All the things outside the contract that we've talked to this point apply here. Secondly, my observation with the risk with the faculty contract is they tend to be very short, they tend to be very strict, and so it really increases the risk to do your due diligence kind of outside the contract, because the contract itself is not going to give you a whole lot of insight other than how much you're going to get paid and what you cannot do. So this slide helps just think through, if you're going to start your own practice, the list of things that you have to do. My big picture thing here is you really have to start in advance. If you're going to start a practice August 1st of next year, you know, getting your contracts with insurance and getting your credentialing done, you know, you need to really be thinking about that 6 months out. And then, you know, there's getting your legal entity set up and getting your space. Those things are not things you have to be doing right now, but it generally, when someone wants to go start their own practice, I would say it's extremely aggressive when they go for 3 months, a goal of a 3-month shoot, and probably doable comfortably at 6 months. And you know, you just deal with the circumstances that you have, and some, you know, we don't always have that luxury, but those are the issues that have to be considered. And then another kind of offshoot is acquiring an existing practice. In y'all's industry, you don't see that as much in your specialty, I guess, but it does happen from time to time. You know, it'll typically be a more senior doctor who's ready to move on and retire, and you know, there may be an opportunity to acquire that practice. You want to do all the same questions of what are you buying and what are you getting, and you really want to be mindful of what are you signing on to. If it's a high overhead practice or a high overhead lease that's going to put you at a real disadvantage, then it doesn't, you know, that can offset a lot of other positives about the opportunity. So the big takeaways I have is you have to think big picture. It's not a 1 to 3 year decision. Even if you know you're going to be doing something different 1 to 3 years from there, going through that thought process and understanding what's important during this short term versus where you want to be long term are really important. Understanding and becoming educated about the business of medicine, in particular the regulatory risks that you confront, are important. And then becoming educated about your prospective employer. And again, if I haven't plugged it enough, I'm plugging Boston, because we will dive deeper, and it'll look and feel a lot like this presentation. We'll just have it turned at a slightly different angle and hopefully give you a more three-dimensional understanding of what your different opportunities are. And then finally, be creative. If you see an opportunity that you really like, but there's parts of it that are just flat out not going to work, think through how you can make it and change it in a way that would work. So that's everything. I'm not sure, Julie, how much time we have remaining, but to the extent we have time,
Actually, we have one more question, and then we'll have to wrap it up.
Okay.
In the bottom left corner, Carlos Sanchez Navarro is asking how to investigate the market and potential earnings for a specific city or location.
I did, Julie, you may not have heard a few, about, 10 slides ago or 5 slides ago, whenever this question first popped up, I happened to see it, and I did walk through that. Okay,
great. If there's any other questions, then I'll invite anyone to type them into the chat box. Otherwise, I think that's it. And I don't see anyone typing.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much for your time this evening. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And we're having comments already. This was great. So great.
Okay,
Thank you so much.
Awesome. You guys have a great evening.
Okay. Thank you so much, Michael. You too.
Yeah. Yes. No. Yeah. Yeah. No, don't remove it. Don't remove it. Just put it. Don't remove it. No, it can be removed. It's a vac. No, it's a vac. Just pass it through the machine. I don't know. It can be removed. Remove it.